Hi, I'm Robbie Bobby. The title of this video is ACoA, Trauma-Focused Step Work. Working the steps in ACoA is not the same experience as in other fellowships. Generally speaking, all 12-step programs are based on the original 12 steps and 12 traditions of AA and follow a similar script. However, it's common for different fellowships to modify Step 1 in order to reflect their personal experience, what they're powerless over, and what made their lives unmanageable. In other words, what brings them to program. Al-Anon also admits to being powerless over alcohol, but in my experience, it's more of an indirect form of powerlessness via the alcoholic or alcoholism in general. The rest of the steps are interpreted exactly the same as AA. Put your will and life into the care of God. Conduct a searching inventory of yourself. Ask God to take your character defects. Make amends to those you've harmed. Continue to monitor your behavior. Seek guidance from a higher power. And finally, carry the message of recovery to others. This provides the foundation for not only continued sobriety, but also for living life on life's terms. I mention Al-Anon because of its connection to ACA, which started as an Al-Anon meeting comprised of adult children who aged out of Alateen, but soon felt out of place. Their laundry list, or 14 traits of an adult child, helped them form their own identity, but also created friction, as it wasn't conference-approved literature. This friction became the catalyst for the birth of a new fellowship. Tony A., author of The Laundry List and co-founder of ACA, described AA and Al-Anon as ACA's parents. He saw AA as the father, Al-Anon as the mother, and ACA as the child who was affected by alcoholism, codependency, and the family dysfunction that accompanies them. That dysfunction was passed down to us. ACA uses the same 12 steps with the following modification to Step 1. We admitted we were powerless over the effects of living with alcoholism or other family dysfunction, that our lives had become unmanageable. What are the effects? The effects are the 14 traits, and they include the tendency to isolate, physically and emotionally, to fear authority figures, angry people, and personal criticism, to seek approval to the point of losing one's identity, to have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, to feel guilty for standing up for ourselves, and so on. Another says that adult children are terrified of abandonment and will do anything to hold on to a relationship. In my opinion, this fear of abandonment is the common thread which runs through all the traits. And below the traits, and below the fear, is an unconscious belief of being unloved and unlovable. I call this the unnamed trait, and it drives all the traits on the laundry list. And these traits are the cumulative effect of emotional wounds caused by childhood trauma. For those who are interested, I put out a 14-part series titled The Laundry List on my YouTube channel. It dives into each of the traits individually. Now, some adult children enter ACA fully aware that they experienced trauma as children. Others are not quite sure because traumatic memories are often repressed and family dysfunction normalized. So, for the latter group, let's look at some definitions of trauma in order to soften denial or jog your memory. Trauma is an emotional, psychological, or physical response to a deeply distressing or life-threatening event that overwhelms your ability to cope. It leaves lasting negative effects on your well-being, shaking your fundamental sense of safety, making you feel helpless or terrified. How trauma is classified. There's acute trauma, which results from a single, isolated, catastrophic event, like a natural disaster, a serious car accident, or an unexpected assault. There's chronic trauma, results from repeated and prolonged exposure to highly stressful events, such as ongoing childhood abuse, domestic violence, or living in a war zone. For some adult children, growing up was like living in a war zone. Complex trauma results from exposure to multiple, varied traumatic events, often of an interpersonal nature. For example, severe childhood neglect or prolonged abuse, occurring in important developmental stages. Systemic and historical trauma, the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over generations across a specific group, often tied to experiences of oppression, discrimination, or systemic racism. This category of trauma aligns with what ACA refers to as the generational transfer of dysfunction. Typical responses and effects. People process experiences differently, and what one person experiences as trauma may not cause distress for another. However, the mind and body frequently react with prolonged or extreme symptoms, which can include intrusion, which is experiencing distressing flashbacks, recurring nightmares, or intrusive thoughts about the event. Avoidance, actively staying away from people, places, or situation that remind you of the trauma. This can happen on a conscious level, but it also happens on an unconscious level. Hyperarousal, feeling constantly on edge, irritable, easily startled, or having difficulty sleeping. AA mentions feeling restless, irritable, and discontent. Negative mood and cognition, persistent feelings of fear, guilt, numbness, or deep sense of detachment from others. Before we continue, I'd like to point out that trauma includes not only what happened to us, but also what didn't happen that should have happened, such as consistent love, protection, or emotional attunement. Many people in ACA initially think, I wasn't abused, only to realize later that chronic neglect, unpredictability, or emotional invalidation were deeply traumatic. Common sources of childhood trauma. Abuse, which includes physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional or psychological abuse. Verbal abuse, which is constant criticism, yelling, or humiliation. Spiritual or religious abuse. Neglect, which includes emotional neglect, parents unemotionally unavailable. Physical neglect, regarding food, clothing, medical care. Education neglect, lack of supervision, failure to protect the child from abuse or danger. Dysfunctional family environment, which includes living with alcoholic or addicted parents, chronic conflict between parents, mental illness in a parent, enmeshment, no healthy boundaries, chronic chaos and unpredictability, extreme control or authoritarian parenting. Loss and separation includes death of a parent or sibling, divorce or abandonment, foster care or institutional care, frequent moves, incarceration of a parent. Chronic fear and insecurity includes walking on eggshells, unpredictable anger or rage in the home, threats of violence, witnessing abuse of siblings or a parent, fear of eviction or homelessness. Emotional injuries include constant criticism, rejection, being ignored or invisible, favoritism among siblings, being blamed for family problems. Developmental trauma includes never feeling safe, never being comforted when distressed, growing up without consistent affection, having to suppress emotions to survive, learning that love is conditional, never knowing what mood a parent would be in, feeling responsible for keeping the peace, having no one to talk to about feelings, growing up emotionally lonely even though both parents were present, becoming the family hero, mascot, scapegoat, lost child, or caretaker. Okay, so that all provides a pretty good overview of trauma. And where there's trauma, you'll often find PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Trauma and PTSD are closely related, but they're not the same thing. Here's a simple way to think about it. Trauma is the event or experience, or the emotional wound that results from it. PTSD is a psychological response to trauma. Many adult children suffered complex trauma as children and suffer complex PTSD as adults. In my opinion, the 14 traits of an adult child, outlined in the laundry list, closely resemble symptoms of complex PTSD. In any event, both trauma and PTSD are mentioned repeatedly in ACA's literature. Which brings us full circle back to the steps. As a follow-up to the laundry list, ACA's founder also wrote 12 new steps focused on recovery from childhood trauma. I see the Tony A steps as the solution or antidote to the traits or childhood trauma. Here are the core steps. Step 3. We made a decision to practice self-love and to trust in a higher power of our understanding. Step 4. We made a searching and blameless inventory of our parents because, in essence, we had become them. 5. We admitted to our higher power, to ourselves, and to another human being, the exact nature of our childhood abandonment. 6. We were entirely ready to begin the healing process with the aid of our higher power. 7. We humbly asked our higher power to help us with our healing process. 8. We became willing to accept our own unconditional love by understanding that our higher power loves us unconditionally. Step 9. We became willing to accept our own unconditional love by understanding that our higher power loves us unconditionally. As you can see, the goal of these steps is to love ourselves unconditionally. By the way, the word love is mentioned 6 times in the Tony A steps. It's mentioned 0 times in the standard steps. I don't say that to knock the standard steps. They serve a different purpose. I point this out because as adult children of alcoholic or otherwise dysfunctional families, our recovery depends on our ability to love ourselves unconditionally. For those who are interested, I put out a 6-part series titled The Inner Child Steps on my YouTube channel, which looks at ACA's alternate steps, otherwise known as the Tony A steps, and a 7-part series titled Self-Love in ACA Recovery. I also put out a 12-part series that compares each of the standard ACA steps with the corresponding Tony A steps. ACA's Yellow Steps Workbook does a great job integrating the 2 sets of steps and dives deep into the topics of grief, shame, childhood loss, blameless inventory of ourselves as well as our parents and extended family. It helps us understand our inner family members, such as the inner child, inner teen, critical inner parent, and inner loving parent. It also looks at each of the 14 traits and helps us see what caused them and how they affect our lives today. For many adult children, this is the first step in healing childhood trauma. And that wraps up this video, which is meant to be food for thought. If you got something out of it, please click like, subscribe, and forward to a fellow traveler. It may help another fellow traveler, and it also helps support this channel. I'm Robbie Bobby. Thank you for watching, and as always, keep coming back.